All right, Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were the first constitution, the Constitution before the Constitution. Written by this guy, 1777, by this guy named John Dickinson, Pennsylvania statesman. During this time, there was a lot of statesmen coming out of Pennsylvania, coming out of Virginia. A lot of the big hitters were out of there. Those two states, really. First accepted by Congress in 1781 and is considered the first national constitution. So all this happened in 1777. If you remember, in 1776, we declared our independence. Continental Congress was going to meet the next year. That'd be 1777. And they realized that they couldn't keep running a government as a committee. They had to have an actual constitution. So they wrote up these Articles of Confederation. It was passed around, and 3-4 years later, it was finally accepted in Congress. The war is still going on at this time. If you remember, the war didn't end until 1783, another 2 years later. It's part of the reason they built this confederation. Remember, confederation is different than a federation. These days, we have a federation. We have a central government that is fairly strong, but it's not too strong. The central government can't tell you who your mayor is going to be, for instance. Like in France can go down and they can tell you, the federal government in France can tell the individual cities who to vote, who their mayor will be. But a confederation was even less restrictive on the states and the localities. But the reason they went with a confederation is because they didn't want too much power in the hands. This guy over here, he's King George III. They didn't want too much power in the hands of one person. And so they had the state governments limit the power of that national Congress. Weaknesses, this has gone over and over and over again all the time. The weaknesses, they couldn't raise taxes. They could beg for money. The Continental Congress could say, hey, Pennsylvania, we need some money for this war. And Pennsylvania could say no and not give them any. So they could ask for taxes, but they couldn't force anybody to give them taxes. They couldn't regulate foreign or state trade. So different states could enter into different kinds of trades with other states as well as with other countries. Laws had to be approved 9 out of 13 states, which is pretty big. Today, we have a 2-chamber Congress. Bicameral is what it's called, 2 chambers. We got the House and the Senate, but they both only need a simple majority, 51%, to pass a law. This needed a supermajority, about 60%. And even when they did pass a law, they didn't have any power to enforce them. There was no national police. They didn't have a national army. Nobody could go around enforcing federal law. No federal regulators at the time. So the war ended, 1783. Treaty of Paris was signed. This is a painting of the signing of the Treaty of Paris. Recognized George Washington, Ben Franklin. There's a couple other people. One of these guys is John Jay, first Supreme Court Justice. Anyway, they hired a portrait painter to come and paint the signing. The British were so mad about losing the war that they didn't show up. So all we get is the Americans who signed the treaty, and the guy who painted the portrait just left the British side blank. So that was something that came out of the Articles of Confederation. We got the Treaty of Paris signed, Northwest Ordinance. We'll talk about that in a minute. And they could declare war, print the money, make treaties, settle state disputes. So that was some good things that came out of it. One of the strengths here, the Northwest Territory, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee. The land ordinance, state of land in the West, was to be surveyed using a grid system to establish 6-mile blocks. I don't know why I don't have that grid system on here to show you guys, but Yep, still not there either. But that's proved through all the way settling territory, all the way through, it's called the Midwest, as well as the West, and then the West Coast. As we went through the westward expansion, they made these townships, 6-mile blocks, and everything's laid out in a grid that way. Orderly expansion of the state, yep. And the plan for statehood, applying for statehood, it's still in effect today. Once there's enough people who own land, they can create their own government inside of a territory. And when that population inside that territory gets enough, they can petition to become a state. Right now, Puerto Rico has petitioned to become the 51st state. It's being held up in Congress. Congress doesn't have to approve that. Back in the 1800s, they didn't approve Utah for a very long time, or a few other states that they didn't approve over the years. Okay, so these 5 states, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, okay, 6 states. Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin. Don't know why it's not, Minnesota isn't listed. Anyway, these 6 states, it's called the Rust Belt, also the Midwest, called the Rust Belt because a lot of factories moved in there during the 50s and 60s and then moved out during the 90s and early 2000s. And all the machinery is just kind of sitting there and rusting. So anyway, we've got those 6 states out of that Northwest Territory. If you remember the Treaty of Paris, the Northwest Territory was ceded by the British during that treaty, pretty big chunk of land, as well as access to the Great Lakes, Missouri River, Mississippi River, Ohio River. They all kind of converge right in there. Orderly process for settlement, yep. And it promised no slavery. That was kind of a big thing at this time. I think maybe New Hampshire and Massachusetts were the only states that didn't have slavery. Not really that it was illegal, just that they didn't have slaves. Promised education. At least one of those townships in each state would be given up to a university. So you talk about the land grant universities in the West, and that's where they came from. For the football fans, like the Big Ten football conference, that kind of stuff. That's where those universities and colleges came from. Freedom of religion, you could practice whatever religion you wanted, and a trial by jury. Remember, these are before the Constitution and definitely before the Bill of Rights. So this was something that was baked in to that Northwest Ordinance prior to our Constitution. All right, the big thing that really kicked off a need, that showed the need for a new or fixing the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and creating a more centralized style of government, was Shays Rebellion. Shays is this guy, Daniel Shays. Here, you see him shining flintlock musket there and his powder horn and stuff. How this came about, the farmers, they're required to pay their debt in gold, in hard money. The cash money, the paper money, is pretty much worthless. But they didn't have any money because they weren't paid for the war. Shays, he's a vet, he's an Army vet, worked for the Continental Congress or fought with the Continental Congress, and he didn't get paid after the war. All the wealthy lawmakers who invested their money in the war, they're not getting paid back either. So they're not getting paid from the government. The soldiers aren't getting paid for the government. They can't really go after the government because they're in the government, so they go after the farmers. And the farmers don't have anything. So these poor farmers, they all got together. They weren't represented in the legislature, so they couldn't pass debt relief laws. So this is a picture on a courthouse here where the rebels, Shays boys, Shays rebels, they're going to courthouse. They shut down the courthouse, wouldn't let it do its job. there are direct ties to some of the things that have been going on in this past year. There was a courthouse up in Michigan that was shut down by protesters. There was a Congress that was shut down up in Michigan by protesters as well. A lot of this has parallels to today. They're going to free prisoners from debtors, or free debtors from prisons. At this time, if you owed a lot of money, you could go to prison for it until that debt was paid off by your friends or family or whoever, or you just sit in prison until the debt got paid. So they were going to bust into prisons, and they did bust into prisons, and they let their buddies go. And like I said, they closed their courts. See these guys fighting, these other guys cheering it on. Massachusetts militia is called out. The reason the militia is called out is because the federal government can't send troops. Massachusetts actually asked the Continental Congress, asked the Congress under the Articles of Confederation to send out federal troops, and the Congress said no, can't do it. Federal Congress said no, can't do it. So the Massachusetts militia had to go out and stop it. As a result of this, the farmers, they got to elect officials that would support their cause. Prior to that, they didn't have any elected officials. Now they get to get elected officials in. And they can close the courthouses that are putting their buddies in jail, and they can request or demand help from Congress. And this is what really prompted leaders to create that stronger central government, which we'll go over in other lessons. So what did our founding fathers think about it? It's Thomas Jefferson. You might remember him as the author of the Declaration of Independence. He said a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. Every now and then you got to let your lawmakers, you got to remind your lawmakers who they work for. It's medicine necessary for sound health of government. When people in power forget that their power is derived from the people, they start working towards their own interests rather than the interests of the people. He says, God forbid that we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion. He expected this type of thing to happen about every 20 years. And it's more or less happened just about every 20 years. You can go search up a list of rebellions in the United States, and you'll see that there were pretty big riots like this about every 20 years. So in that regard, Thomas Jefferson, that was his ideas on it. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments.